Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth episode of the Community Relations Corner, a new weekly Zoom and podcast where we discuss issues of concern to the New York Jewish community. And together we chat with our friends and partners who represent the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership of New York. I'm your host, Michael Miller. I'm the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, of the JCRC. And today we are joined by my friend, New York City Councilmember Mark Levine, who is also chair of the council's Committee on Health and former chair. We worked very closely together when he was chair of the council's Jewish Caucus. We're going to speak with Mark about how the pandemic is affecting the city and particularly how various Jewish communities are facing COVID-19. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of the Community Relations Corner is sponsored by the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reform Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to view a 360-degree panorama of its magnificent stained glass sanctuary and immerse yourself in a piece of Queens Jewish history. All are invited to join for a wide array of programming and webinars, and the beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden will be available for a rental to add to your joyous occasions, to your simchas. Check out the synagogue's website at freesynagogueflushing.org to learn more about Shabbat and holiday services, with the holiday of Sukkot coming up this Friday night, and Shabbat and Sunday, and weekly Sunday school. Once again, visit freesynagogueflushing.org. And seamlessly, we now are honored to welcome our fourth guest on the corner, the first Jewish guest on the Community Relations Corner, New York City Councilmember Mark Levine. Shalom, welcome. The embrace of multiculturalism, promoting Jewish culture in the city, et cetera, et cetera. This is the opportunity to really, Mark, share with our viewers and listeners who you are. Please.
Wow, thank you so much. I actually grew up in Columbia, Maryland, from a Jewish perspective. New York. I really got much more Jewishly involved, amongst many other things, reconnecting to family in Israel that I had a chance to visit a number of times, and along the way picked up Hebrew. Actually, I had much better Spanish at the time. I learned Spanish living in Spain in college, so I had to play catch up there. And now I'm really happy to have a multilingual household. Our two boys' bar mitzvahs were a trilingual affair, the requisite English and Spanish, but also a healthy dose, the requisite English and Hebrew and a healthy dose of Spanish. And of course, we live in an incredible community of Washington Heights, which is itself multicultural in so many ways. And so the intersection of
I spent a lot of
Latino culture.
I spent a lot of time.
Yes, you have. In Washington Heights, yes. Yes, indeed. Well, YU is a pillar of the community, and it's also, of course, home to a huge and important part of my life and my family's life. And I think the community is a great example of intergroup relations, building on a common history and culture. And there are challenges. We have more work to do for sure. But it's been a big part of who I am, and not just professional, but personal life. The high holidays, my goodness, unusual, unlike any other. I would say the highlight for me, I got to be part of a tashlich on the West Harlem Piers, 125th Street in the Harlem. Yeah, it was led by this amazing community called Kehilat Harlem, which is really a wonderful and growing community in West Harlem and Uptown, and just a beautiful setting and a beautiful opportunity for reflection. I'm very much looking forward to Sukkot. I think it's basically the Jewish equivalent of outdoor dining, which we've all been enjoying for months. And a relatively open air way to have a meal in this ancient structure that connects us to tradition in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, wow. But I understand that you started out as a bilingual, not trilingual, but a bilingual math and science
Right.
teacher in the South Bronx. What led you into the political arena, Mark?
So teaching at Junior High School 149 in District 7 in the South Bronx, really, it was probably about the best education I ever got. I just learned so much from my students and my family and their families. And after teaching, I went on to start a nonprofit, actually in Washington Heights, that was very much looking to respond to one of the greatest challenges that the families in my school were experiencing, and families in low-income neighborhoods all over the city, which is lack of access to financial services, where unfortunately, even today, still for many families, financial services are through check cashing stores and pawn shops and loan sharks, in Spanish called prestamistas. And so I started a nonprofit, a community development credit union. It's called Neighborhood Trust, to help families get access to financial services. The credit union is still going strong. It's made $25 million in small loans to folks uptown, helping people buy a home computer, pay for education, start a small business. The repayment rate is 98%, incredible testament to the community. And that really is the base that allowed me to ultimately win election to the city council, the credit union membership. And I'm really proud to have won election now twice in the incredible 7th council district, which is one of the most diverse, I might even say the most diverse in New York City. It runs from 96th Street on the west side up through Morningside Heights and Manhattanville and West Harlem and through up to Southern Washington Heights, where I live. And representing it now for about 7 years has just been the honor of a lifetime.
Do you miss the classroom? Do you?
Very much.
Yeah.
Very much. I'm still in touch with some of the students, believe it or not, all these years later. I'm incredibly proud of them and how many have gone on to work in science or science-related fields. I often say that being an elected official is tough, but it's actually only the second hardest job I've ever had. Being a teacher was the hardest job I've ever had, Michael. I have so much respect for the folks who are in the classroom. And my goodness, now, what they've been through the last 7 months, just heroic efforts by them. And what I've seen out in the schools, which I've had a chance to visit so far this week, I'm just in awe of what the teachers have pulled off in these very difficult circumstances. But having been there myself, I just have a unique appreciation for how difficult the career is and how important it is.
But I'm going to get back to that in a second. I want to just step back another step beyond that regarding your chairmanship of the Jewish Caucus. That role that you played, that you can share with us in terms of what you experienced, what you learned, broadening your horizons. There are about a dozen members, if I remember correctly, of the Jewish Caucus. How did that role play itself out and influence your thinking regarding the Jewish community and the place of the Jewish community here in New York?
Yes. So actually, there were 14 members of the Jewish Caucus last term, which was an all-time high, still is an all-time high. I certainly had real-life confirmation of the adage, 14 Jews, 15 opinions.
Only 15?
Yeah, on a good day, sometimes more. In all seriousness, a very, very diverse group in many ways, certainly in terms of perspective, reflecting very diverse districts that we've all been elected from. And that's a beautiful thing. Actually, not all the districts are majority Jewish necessarily, which is the result of coalition building and something I certainly celebrate. On a more substantive policy front, we worked a lot on Jewish poverty, and I have to admit to having underestimated the extent
Yeah.
of poverty in New York City's Jewish communities, which is painfully extensive. And I think that I don't think I'm alone or was alone. I think that even in the Jewish community, the extent of poverty in our community is underestimated. And I've thought a lot about why that is. I think it has to do with an unfortunate sense of shame that people feel about that. And it's something that remains hidden. But I mean, there are people who are struggling and who need help providing food for their families. And that's particularly true amongst elderly Jewish New Yorkers, and most painfully and really unacceptably amongst a segment of elderly Jewish New Yorkers, which are Holocaust survivors.
Right.
And so I'm probably the thing I'm most proud of in that term, and I think a lot of us in the Jewish Caucus are proud of, is that we created a new initiative that funds support for Holocaust survivors. Right. And I have to recognize a shout out to our former colleague, Raphael Espinal, who, though not a member of the Jewish Caucus, really led that effort. Mm-hmm. But it's now created a recurring, I think at this point, over $2 million initiative to fund more than a dozen nonprofits who are supporting, at this point, it's very aging population, but Holocaust survivors who are struggling, many of whom struggling with economic needs and other needs. And I'm really proud we've been able to help them.
Right, that's really outstanding work. And we also know about Holocaust survivors, senior Holocaust survivors who are of Russian extraction, who have just come here over the past 20 years or so, yeah. And the challenges that they are facing. So it isn't just longstanding Americans right. or New Yorkers who came here after the war, but those who just came here recently, who find it very, very difficult. So the information that was circulated, I assume, was in multiples of languages.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, the Russian community is a large component of Holocaust survivors in New York City, and the numbers might shock people, but tens of thousands. The numbers are dwindling. I believe it's still over 40,000,
really?
And that makes us one of, if not the largest community of Holocaust survivors of any city globally. And so it needs attention. It would be unconscionable if people who have survived the horrors of the war now in their twilight years here in New York were neglected. And so we can't let that happen.
And we're really proud of the fact that you are there with your colleagues, but you in many leadership capacities, ensuring that they have the sustenance to live dignified lives after all that they have suffered. Speaking about suffering on a different level through this pandemic and back into the school system, can you share with us your views on the reopening policies of the city, and did they do everything right? What else might they do in order to ensure the safety, security of not only the students, but the teachers as well, and the principals and supervisors?
Yes, I mean, I'm really worried about this. I was amongst those council members, more than 30 of us ultimately, who called for delays in the opening of the public schools because we just felt that the system wasn't ready. I am concerned about staffing problems, some of which I've witnessed myself being out there in schools in the early days. There are concerns about the broader spread of the virus right now, which is on the rebound at almost the exact moment when we've begun to reopen the schools. And that's going to manifest itself in the school communities. There's no way it can't. And we need to protect students and staff and teachers and everyone in the school. And, that might not ultimately be possible, Michael. This is early days, and we have a lot of resource problems to fix. We have to put into place a robust testing regime that delivers results in a timely manner. We have to ramp up contact tracing in our schools in a big way. It's extremely resource intensive and very complicated. And I'm hopeful that it's possible, but with the operational challenges so far, and as I mentioned, with the virus coming back, I'm very concerned about it.
But with you as chair of the Committee on Health, how does that leadership role manifest itself? What powers, what influence on policy does this committee have within the City Council that impacts on all New Yorkers, not just members of your own district?
I mean, officially, the job of the committee is to provide oversight to the city's Department of Health, which is a massive agency, $1.7 billion budget, and also to pass legislation related to health. So it's been a very active time for the committee, you can imagine. For me, it's also been important to use the role to stand up for science in the midst of this pandemic, at a time where, frankly, that perspective has been under assault, and to use my platform to push out science-based information to the public, to people in my district and citywide, based on my access to experts, to epidemiologists, to people in emergency departments, to public health leaders who know more than me. I think it's been helpful to have a science background. I studied physics in college, and not that I claim any credentials on that front at this point, but it's been helpful to give me a science-based framing to look at this pandemic. Unfortunately, Michael, it's an ongoing crisis. We're exhausted by coronavirus. The city is exhausted by this. We're exhausted by the lockdown measures and the precautions we have to take. But the virus never went away. Even in the summer, where we had remarkable stability, where pretty consistently we were 250 cases a day about. But still, that threat remained, and in the last few weeks, those numbers are moving in the wrong direction, which we can talk about. But New Yorkers we just can't let our guard down yet, because there's still a tough fight ahead.
Right, and as we have seen in minority populations, the potential for infection is much higher than it is in white populations, and the healthcare disparities. We're creating now a coalition at JCRC just on healthcare disparities. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-faith coalition. Once again, within the framework of the health of the city of New York, over which you have oversight. I think that's a critical issue to ensure that everyone, regardless of their social status or economic status, is provided with quality health care.
You're right, Michael. I mean, this pandemic has both highlighted and exacerbated tremendous inequality, racial inequality, socioeconomic inequality in New York City and nationally. The numbers don't lie. Fatality rates have been more than double for New Yorkers of color relative to white New Yorkers. And if you really see it dramatically, if you look at it neighborhood by neighborhood, where Black and brown neighborhoods in New York City have had fatality rates 5-10 times in some cases higher than whiter and wealthier neighborhoods, if you do a zip code by zip code comparison. And that reflects, of course, inequality in access to healthcare and structural racism in the way healthcare is delivered. It also reflects inequality in housing, because this virus spreads much more easily in overcrowded housing and overcrowded apartments. And it's why in places like the South Bronx and Corona and Washington Heights and Inwood, you've seen a much more rapid spread, partly because of the housing conditions. Also, we've seen tremendous inequality in employment drive this. The people who are out there as essential workers are overwhelmingly or disproportionately people of color. They have been exposed. They have taken a risk for us. Many have gotten sick. A heartbreaking number have died. Some have brought the virus home to their families. We owe them an enormous debt, but that has also driven the inequality. And so we can't look away from this. And if there's any positive opportunity out of this horror of the last 7 months, is that I don't think society can and will ignore that inequality. And this could be a once in a generation opportunity to confront it and fix it.
And so what can government do about it? What are people who are watching this program and looking to the chair of the health committee? What optimism can we have that this issue is actually going to be addressed so that everybody will have access to quality health care?
Well, I think we have to finally, as a society, say once and for all, from a moral perspective and a practical public health perspective, that it's unacceptable for anyone in this society, regardless of their wealth, their citizenship, their documentation status. It's unacceptable for anyone not to have health insurance. That has profound impact on people's health. It has that impact in New York City, and it has led to inequality in the underlying conditions which have driven inequality in this pandemic. Let's use this moment to finally fix that. There's also embedded racism in the healthcare system, documented levels of inequality. The rates of maternal mortality for Black mothers in New York City, I'm not talking about other parts of the country, are 12 times greater than it is for white mothers. And the healthcare system is riddled with that kind of inequality, driven by disparate treatment of particularly Black patients, but all patients of color. And so we have to confront that now. We have to fix it. This moment should, if nothing else, force us to confront these inequalities.
Well, thank you for responding to that. And we're going to just take a pause and give our thanks to the sponsor of this episode of the Community Relations Corner, the Free Synagogue of Flushing, which is serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org to view a 360-degree panorama of its magnificent stained glass sanctuary and immerse yourself in a piece of Queens Jewish history. All are invited to join for a wide array of programming and webinars, and the beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden will be available for rental to add to your joyous occasions. Check out the synagogue's website at freesynagogueflushing.org to learn more about their Shabbat and holiday services, with Sukkot coming up, as we discussed, and weekly Sunday school. Once again, visit freesynagogueflushing.org. And back to the issues. So we look forward towards economic recovery from the pandemic, and how might you and other elected officials see this moment of crisis as potentially as an opportunity to make our city even stronger than it was before the outbreak of this menace?
Well, I don't want to minimize the challenge that we face right now as a city economically, the fiscal challenge for city government and state government too, obviously, and the pain that that's causing, not just among small business owners, but among people who have lost their jobs. Over 1 million New Yorkers have lost their livelihood. And this is going to be a long fight, Michael. Perhaps even could outlast the immediate period of the pandemic. But ultimately, I am really confident that the city is going to come back economically and otherwise. In part because we have, again and again, throughout our history for hundreds of years, we've come back from infectious disease and natural disaster and a terrorist attack and economic collapse. And I'm confident that the things that have drawn tourists here in the past will draw tourists here again. The things that have made this a center for the arts will continue to make it a center for the arts and draw people from the creative sectors. And then ultimately employers are going to see this as the best place in the world to locate, because this is where employees want to be. But in the meantime, I'm really worried about small businesses, about restaurants, many of which have already gone out of business. Outdoor dining has been a lifeline, not just for those of us in the public, but also for restaurants. We started yesterday a limited indoor dining at 25%. We are extending outdoor dining now through the winter by allowing outdoor heaters. Very excited about that. Other parts of the country, of the world do it, even colder climates. We're going to need to do a lot more to support small business now in the months ahead. They're going to need rent relief and resetting of leases because many of them are accumulating unpaid rent. They're going to need financial assistance. They're going to need access to credit. And for the broader employment sector, we do have to find a way to get people back into office buildings, Michael, because there's a whole ecosystem of businesses that operate around every office building, from street vendors to shoe repair to restaurants to theaters. And they're dying now because only about 10% of office workers have come back. And I think we can find a way to start to bring office workers back with tremendous safety precautions built in. And that has a secondary benefit of all the businesses that survive on having people in Midtown and downtown every day.
Well, you've raised a lot of issues, and I wish we had all afternoon to discuss each and every one of them and drill down. I haven't been back to my office since March. I've been working at home. The vast majority of my team have been working from home. And people have adapted to this new reality because we don't know when the level of safety is going to be there to allow us to give us a sense of comfort that we're going to be healthy going to work and coming back from work, let alone within our buildings. But again, without drawing myself into that any further, let's talk about some of the Jewish dimensions of the impact of this pandemic. We've all seen the headlines. We've seen the news stories about the outbreak in a number of communities, number of neighbors, number of zip codes that are predominantly populated by members of the Orthodox community. And some of our viewers and listeners may be living in those districts as we speak. What is it? Why is this happening from your perspective? Is the city responding, the city, the state? Are people responding as they should respond? What can the city do? What can the city council do in order to ensure the safety of all New Yorkers, as well as those within these particular neighborhoods who we all want to be safe as well?
The city has to do better in building relationships around public health with every single marginalized community. That's really how public health works. But specifically now, talking about Orthodox communities, Hasidic communities, from communities more broadly, that requires linguistic skills in some neighborhoods, not all Orthodox neighborhoods, but we had a hearing in the city council yesterday in which it emerged, Tuesday, the hearing was Tuesday, in which it emerged that we have virtually no Yiddish-speaking contact tracers out of a contact tracing workforce of 3,600. They wouldn't tell us exactly, but they would say, all they would say is the number is between 0 and 6. And I'm led to believe it is much closer to 0 than 6. I mean, that's really unacceptable. And it reflects a bigger problem. And it's not just about the Yiddish speaking staffing. It's about cultural competency. And ultimately it's about building trust and having pre-existing relationships before you are in the midst of a burning crisis. And so we have to do better on that front to build relationships and trust. And I will say on an optimistic note that there's been really good work done by the city and by leaders in the Orthodox community of late, particularly beginning on I would say Erev Yom Kippur, a strong mobilization to get the word out on mask wearing, which really has improved a lot in recent days. In Borough Park and other neighborhoods, there's been a lot more mobilization of rabbinic leadership, and Hatzalah is doing great. So I'm hopeful, but that this is going to be a long fight. The numbers are still moving. Even from yesterday to today, Michael, the numbers in some of those neighborhoods got significantly worse. So I don't want anyone to think that we're out of it. Just because mask usage has improved on 13th Avenue, we are not out of it. In fact, there's a delay in the way this virus manifests, and we could see worsening cases for weeks. And most painfully, we could start to see rising ER admissions. And in fact, yesterday, for the first time, and we haven't been able to say this really since June, there's been a slight increase in emergency department visits for COVID-like symptoms. And so I want to stress how serious this is, Michael. It really is deadly serious.
It really is. We all recognize that, and so much work has been, we've been working with behind the scenes, as we generally do, with leaders in the Hasidic community and the general Jewish population to just raise consciousness. And it's so important to model for your community, those who are leaders, that that wearing a mask is not something to be embarrassed over. It's not an encumbrance. It's a level of safety and security and assurance that you will protect others, let alone protect yourself. And so much more needs to be done across the board. This is not just about the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community. This is about all, not only in New York, but across the country and around the world. I mean, the numbers are really frightening, particularly the numbers coming out of Israel are terribly unsettling.
Yes.
And I read the story and then the New York Post about your hearing the other day. And how is it possible that, again, 3,600 people in the unit and less than 6, they have to report if there are 6, but less than 6 are Yiddish speakers? How many of them are we spoke about the Russian community before, how many of them are Russian speakers? And there might be other language groups.
So they've done better. They've done better on some of the other languages. Sorry to interrupt. Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
They have done better on some of the other languages. They have over 200 Spanish speakers as well. They should. They have, I believe, I don't recall the exact number, but a few dozen Russian speakers and other less prevalent languages, Yoruba, for example, which I absolutely celebrate. We need to pay more attention to some of the smaller language communities. But, you know, Yiddish is actually not one of the smaller language communities. It ranks, at last I checked, number 7 in most widely spoken language in New York City. And of course, in some of the more affected communities right now, it's quite prevalent. So it does deserve more attention. And I think there are some challenges with the way they've designed the job requirements for contact tracers, requiring advanced degrees in some cases, which I think are an unnecessary barrier to do this job. I think there's people out there who've got the language skills, who have cultural competency, who would be amazing contact tracers, that we shouldn't be turning away just because they don't have, for example, a BA degree.
Right. Just to shift in terms of our topics to an issue of concern, particularly to the Jewish community, but to many others. Before the pandemic hit, there was a dramatic spike in anti-Semitic incidents in New York and other incidents of hate impacting on other communities. And you were the lead sponsor of the original bill to create the city's office for the prevention of hate crimes. We all know that this office is relatively new. But what led you to taking on this challenge, and how do you think the city currently is dealing with it? We're all concerned in the Jewish community for the potential for anti-Semitism at any time, including now. But
Yes.
once we get beyond this big wave, this tidal wave of the pandemic, might there be a resurgence of anti-Semitism and acts of hate as there was prior to its hitting?
Well, there's been a resurgence in hate crimes in New York City, really for 5 years. The largest category, unfortunately, is anti-Semitic hate crimes, but there's been an increase in many other categories, including anti-Muslim hate crimes. And we wanted to mobilize the city to respond in a coordinated way that cuts across agencies and that brings together everything from the Education Department to the Human Rights Commission to the NYPD to the Department of Health, the Department of Parks, in a way that's coordinated and strategic. And that's why we wanted to pass this legislation, which I'm really proud we did. I'm sorry to say that the pandemic has once again revealed some pretty ugly tendencies. And early on, the Asian communities of New York City, specifically Chinese American communities of New York City, were targeted in extremely ugly ways, totally unwarranted. And you and I and many others spoke out against that. Unfortunately, the Jewish community has been targeted as well. This is really the third time in a year that the Jewish community has been targeted related to a public health crisis. The measles outbreak last year, right. The early stage of coronavirus, when as you recall, some of the earliest identified patients were Jewish, and now in the last week or two, during what has been a resurgence, and it's just unacceptable, and we have to call it out. And we've seen now beyond a doubt that hate speech leads to acts of violence. We can't wall off or dismiss hate speech. And so this deserves real attention, and it's certainly an important function of the city's relatively new office to prevent hate crimes.
Yeah, I think that all of us were very unsettled by that spike, and we're also still concerned, and considering how much attention is appropriate attention is being brought to the pandemic, we can't lose sight of the issue of hate crimes, and it's good that and I thank you very much on behalf of all the people who are participating in this for being the lead sponsor of that bill and for the creation of that office. The executive director, Deborah Lauder, has been a longtime colleague of mine in the community relations world at the Anti-Defamation League and at the Community Relations Council in Atlanta. And she's an outstanding professional. And I just hope that she's given all the resources, and the city council can ensure that she's given all the resources necessary to ensure that she can be effective at the work that she is doing.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to kind of wind up and talk about the Israel issue. How can we have a conversation with a Jewish professional and the former chair of the Jewish Caucus, let alone the fact that you're a fluent Hebrew speaker, and not talk about Israel? We just recently experienced a very disturbing controversy around a questionnaire that was circulated by the Democratic Socialists of America, by the DSA, to city council candidates for those who would be succeeding you as a term limited member of the New York City Council, that asked only 2 questions in their foreign policy section. And the fact that even in this questionnaire there was a foreign policy section is interesting, let alone the fact there are only 2 questions. They only related to Israel, and one, if invited on a trip to Israel by an organization, what's referred to as a junket, would they pledge not to go? And you had gone on a JCRC mission in 2015. We thank you for that. And the second question was, do you support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement? And if not, why not? And do you feel that that was an appropriate way of determining as to who receives an endorsement by a national political movement? What attitudinally, what was your reaction to that? Did any members of your community in your district who were planning on running for that seat speak to you about it?
Oh, I was and remain outraged by it. It's absolutely unacceptable. It is the definition of a double standard. We have had delegation visits to many countries in my time in the city council, right. Including, not by myself personally, but there have been city council trips to China and to Russia and to Turkey. No one ever raised any objections before or after any of those trips, Michael. The only place that anyone raises objections to us visiting, it happens to be the single majority Jewish country on earth, Israel. Again, it's the definition of a double standard, and it's absolutely counterproductive to the cause of building mutual understanding, which is that we need to have an exchange, a cultural exchange, to understand each other, to understand different countries, diverse communities of different countries. And my goodness, what a complicated region Israel and the Middle East is. And to be there in person is an critical way of understanding it. And I think it's outrageous that we would want less dialogue. It's counterproductive to the cause of peace. And, I'll point out that you read the amended version of that questionnaire. The original version just said, will you commit not to visit Israel?
Right, correct.
And so that would mean that I can't visit my cousins there. I guess that's what they were asking. Again, there are myriad despotic regimes on earth, but according to that questionnaire, you can visit any of them except for one. And that's really outrageous. And so I called it out, and I was relieved or gratified that many of our colleagues in government did as well. But as you see, the question remains still on the questionnaire, which is very unfortunate.
And by the way, it's not that you were referring to Israel as a despotic regime. Yes.
Forgive me. Thank you for clarifying.
Yes, it's a democracy. You can disagree with the government, but it's still a democracy.
Absolutely.
I want to end our discussion, our conversation on a positive note, a very positive note, and that is the new peace agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain and potentially other countries. How do you think that, and I actually had a discussion internally today with some of my colleagues across the country just about that issue. How do you think that opportunity for Israel after all of these years of 72 years of living in a war zone, in essence, that opening up this potential for there to be diplomatic relations, economic, business relations, commercial relations between Israel and other Arab states, and with the hope, of course, for there to be a two-state solution from our perspective to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Are you more optimistic than before? And if so, how much more optimistic?
Well, first, I want to say that I am a very strong supporter of a two-state solution to the conflict, and that I remain really pained at the failure to achieve such a solution, and I continue to advocate for it. Having said that, I think that the opening up of diplomatic relations between now two Gulf countries, UAE and Bahrain, is an unmitigated positive for the region and for Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. It's going to open up person-to-person contacts with the benefits that I was just speaking about. When people have direct contact and they gain greater understanding, it reduces the possibility of conflict and cuts through the ignorance that is still so prevalent between cultures. It opens up economic vistas for all three countries, and I hope it'll serve as a model and will be the beginning of what will be a trend of deepening ties. Israel is a Middle Eastern country. Israel is located smack in the middle of the Middle East, and that in ways that I don't think people who haven't been there realize. It permeates the culture there, but it's an untapped potential for offering economic opportunity, cultural exchange, and I truly celebrate the growing ties between Israel and its neighbors.
It's interesting. Just looking at my phone, I just got a Facebook Messenger message from a person in Morocco, who's watching this on Facebook and giving us a thumbs up, Mark. So we must be doing something right. But thank God for Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. One thing that I know about this is that if these diplomatic relations continue, that you're not only going to know English, Spanish, and Hebrew, but you'll probably become an Arabic, fluent in Arabic as well.
To our friends in Al Maghreb, Labes.
Aywa. Mark, thank you so much for being on the corner with us, and particularly from my perspective with me. It's truly been a pleasure speaking with you today. To all of our listeners, our viewers from around the world, please follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Levine NYC to see all of his work that he does for us as New Yorkers, and that this episode of the Community Relations Corner is and has been sponsored by the Free Synagogue of Flushing, serving the Reformed Jewish community in Queens, New York for over a century. Visit freesynagogueflushing.org, and I hope you get a chance to go there yourself, Mark, to view a 360-degree panorama of its magnificent stained glass sanctuary and immerse yourself in a piece of Queens Jewish history. All are invited to join for a wide array of programming and webinars, and the beautiful sanctuary, social hall, and meditation garden will be available for rental to add to your joyous occasions. Check out the synagogue's website at freesynagogueflushing.org to learn more about Shabbat and holiday services and weekly Sunday school. Once again, freesynagogueflushing.org, whose president, Ed Schauder, is a member of the JCRC board, and whose cantor and executive director, Alan Brava, is a terrific friend. We thank them for their sponsorship. And I'm going to give you the opportunity for a last word, Mark.
Toda Rabba, Toda, Rabbi Miller, Chag Sameach. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos. Les deseo todo lo mejor. Feliz año. Thank you very much. It's been a true pleasure and an honor. And shukran jazilan.
Shukran is right. Toda, shalom. Thanks to our audience for joining us live. I'm Michael Miller, together with Councilmember Mark Levine, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Community Relations Corner. Shalom, Chag Sameach. Take good care.
Bye-bye.